Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be talking about self-supervised learning in medicine. And,
Oh, yeah.
AI in medicine, it's really exciting stuff. But
It
one
is.
of the big bottlenecks is that you need so much labeled data
Right.
to train these algorithms.
Yeah. You need hundreds of thousands, sometimes even millions of data points.
Right. And that can take,
Yeah.
think about
Oh.
how long it would take experts to label all that. It's just,
Yeah, it's not really feasible in a lot of cases.
right. And so this is where self-supervised learning comes
Yeah.
in, because this is where
It's a game changer.
yeah. This is a way for the algorithm to learn
And if you
from
have
data that hasn't been labeled, which
Mm.
we have tons of.
Absolutely, we have tons of that.
Yeah. So maybe you can just kind of like set the stage for us. Like, what is this
Okay.
self-supervised learning, and how is
Yeah.
it different from kind of like the
Sure. So traditionally, when we talk about machine learning in medicine, we're talking about what's called supervised learning. And this is where you give the algorithm a bunch of labeled data. You say, okay, this image is a cat, this image is a dog, and the algorithm learns to distinguish between the two. The problem is that, like you mentioned, getting those labels is super expensive, it's time consuming. So self-supervised learning kind of flips that on its head and says, what if we could leverage the vast amount of unlabeled data that we have?
right? So we're not giving it the answer. We're just kind of like giving it
So,
all
okay,
this information.
You're giving it the data and you're saying, figure it out, find the patterns, find the relationships.
Right.
And there are some really clever ways to do this.
Okay.
And so one example of this is there was a study where they used contrastive learning, which is a type of self-supervised learning,
Okay.
to analyze chest x-rays.
Mhm.
And they were able to actually identify early signs of heart disease that were missed by radiologists.
Oh, wow. So the AI was
Yeah.
finding things.
It was picking up on these subtle patterns that
Wow.
humans weren't even seeing.
That's pretty remarkable.
It is, and it makes you wonder what other things are hidden in the data that we're just not even aware of yet.
Right. And so
Yeah.
you mentioned contrastive learning. What are some of the other
Sure.
types of
Sure. Contrastive learning is one.
Okay.
The other big one that we see in medicine is what's called generative learning.
Okay. And how is that different?
So contrastive learning is all about sort of comparing things. You give it two images. You say, are these similar or are these different?
Okay.
Generative learning is more about you give it a piece of data that's incomplete and you say, fill in the missing pieces.
Oh, I see. I see.
So you can think of it like a fill in the blank exercise
Wow.
for AI.
So, like, for example, if you're trying to train
Yeah.
a model on electronic health records.
Right. You could give it an electronic health record that has some missing data points, like maybe the patient's blood pressure is missing for a particular visit, and you can ask the model to predict what that blood pressure should be based on the rest of the information in the record.
Oh, I see. I see.
And by doing this, the model is forced to learn the underlying relationships
Right.
between all those different variables in the electronic health record.
Okay. So it's not just filling in blanks. It's actually like
Mhm.
learning about
Yeah.
all the different.
It's learning the underlying structure of the data.
Right. Okay. And so, we've got these two different approaches,
Yeah.
contrastive learning and generative learning.
Right.
How do researchers decide which one to use?
That's a really good question.
Because they seem,
Yeah. They are very different.
yeah, they seem like they're doing
Yeah.
very different things.
Right. Yeah. It really depends on the specific problem that you're trying to solve and the type of data that you have available. So, if you have a lot of image data, for example, a contrastive learning might be a really good approach. If you have a lot of sequential data, like electronic health records or time series data, then generative learning might be a better choice.
So it sounds like there's not like a kind of like a,
There's no one size fits all.
yeah, rule of thumb. Like if you're
Right. It's very much a case-by-case basis.
Right.
And it often takes some experimentation to figure out what works best for a particular problem.
So it sounds like it's a lot of trial and error and kind of,
A bit, yeah.
yeah.
It's a bit of an art as well as a science. You have to have a good understanding of the problem that you're trying to solve, the data that you have available, and then you can start to think about, okay, what kind of self-supervised learning task would make sense here?
Okay, so we've talked about the how. We talked about, contrastive learning,
Mhm.
generative learning.
Right.
I think now we need to get to the kind of like,
Yeah. So what? Like, why should the
Well-
listener care about this? What does this actually mean
yeah, that's a great
for
question.
healthcare in the real world?
Yeah. So I think there are a few really important implications of self-supervised learning for healthcare.
So what are some of the ways that self-supervised learning can impact healthcare?
Well, I think one of the most exciting areas is personalized medicine.
Mhm.
This idea of tailoring treatments to each individual patient based on their unique characteristics.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Imagine an AI that can analyze not just your medical records, but also your genetic data information from wearables.
Wow.
Tracking your activity and sleep,
Yeah.
environmental factors.
There's really getting it.
Oh, totally.
Exactly.
Right,
It's
right.
putting together all these different pieces of the puzzle to create this really holistic view of your health.
Okay. So how would self-supervised learning actually help with that?
Well, because it can be trained on these massive data sets without needing labels, right?
Yeah.
You can start to uncover these subtle patterns and
All
connections
right.
that might be missed by traditional methods.
Okay, so it's kind of like finding the needle in the haystack.
Yeah, exactly. Like it can
Mhm.
tease out these really fine-grained details that might be really important for making those personalized decisions.
And so we're talking about not just like more accurate diagnoses, but also,
Right.
personalized treatment plans, maybe even
Yes.
preventative strategies.
Yeah, like if we can identify those risk factors early on,
Right.
we can intervene before those conditions even develop.
Okay, so this is all very theoretical.
Yeah.
Are there any like concrete examples of how this is being used in research?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
There's a really interesting study where they used self-supervised learning to analyze retinal images
Okay.
and predict diabetic retinopathy.
Mm-hmm.
And what was really remarkable about this study was that the AI model was able to achieve the same level of accuracy as traditional methods, but using only 25% of the labeled data. Wow.
So that's a huge, huge improvement in efficiency.
Right. So it's not just about accuracy.
Exactly.
It's also about,
It's about making the most of the data that we have.
right. And this has implications.
Oh, absolutely.
We're always talking about how
Yeah.
AI needs all this data.
Right.
Well, maybe we don't need as much if we can use it.
Exactly. And this is particularly important for rare diseases
Right.
where we just don't have these large data sets.
Okay, so we've talked about personalized medicine.
Yeah.
What are some of the other areas where self-supervised learning?
Another really promising area is drug discovery.
Okay, yeah, that's a huge one.
It is. And, traditionally, drug discovery has been this very long and expensive process.
It is. It takes years.
Yeah, it could take decades and billions of dollars to bring a new drug to market.
So how can AI help with that? Well, AI models that are trained on these massive data sets of molecular structures, genomic information, even clinical trial data, can start to predict which compounds are most likely to be effective against a particular disease.
Okay, so it's kind of like speeding up that process.
Exactly. It can help identify those promising drug candidates much earlier in the process.
Okay.
And also help identify potential side effects, optimize drug dosages.
So it's like taking some of the guesswork out.
Yeah, exactly. It's making that process more efficient.
And that obviously has huge implications
Oh, absolutely.
for, the cost of drugs,
Yeah.
the time it takes to develop them.
Right. And, ultimately it's about getting those treatments to patients faster.
Right. Okay. So we've talked about personalized medicine. We've talked about drug discovery.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any other areas where self-supervised learning?
One of the things that I think is really fascinating about self-supervised learning is its potential to actually improve our understanding of disease itself.
Okay. So we're not just talking about treatments. We're actually talking about,
Right. We're talking about really getting at those fundamental mechanisms
uh,
of how diseases develop and progress.
so how can AI do that?
Well, think about all the data that we have available, right? Genomic sequences, protein structures, medical imaging, clinical records.
Yeah.
Self-supervised learning can help us find those hidden connections and patterns within all of that information.
Okay. So it's kind of like connecting the dots.
Exactly. And it might reveal new biomarkers, new drug targets, unexpected relationships between seemingly unrelated conditions.
So it's like we're giving AI this huge jigsaw puzzle,
Yeah, exactly.
and it's kind of figuring out how all the pieces fit together.
Right. And the beauty of it is that it can do this without us having to tell it exactly what to look for.
So we're not limiting it by our own
Exactly.
human biases.
Yeah, and that's really exciting because it opens up the possibility of discovering things that we might have never even thought to look for.
It is exciting. I mean, it's a little daunting, too, because it's
It is. It
a
is.
lot of power.
It is a lot of power, and I think it's important to be mindful of that.
Okay, but so on a practical level, we're talking about these amazing possibilities. Are we actually going to see this happen in our lifetime? Like, what kind of timeline are we looking at for these breakthroughs?
Well, it's always hard to predict the future,
Yeah,
but I think the pace of progress in AI is just astounding.
it is. It is.
And we're already seeing these really promising results in research.
Okay.
So I think it's very likely that self-supervised learning is going to play a really central role in shaping the future of healthcare.
And that's going to happen in the coming years.
Yeah, I think so. I think we're going to see a lot of really exciting developments in the next 5 to 10 years.
Okay, so we should all be paying attention to this.
Absolutely. This is something that's going to affect all of us.
Right, and I think you've done a great job of kind of explaining the complexities of it,
Well, thank you.
but also the potential,
Yeah,
which is really what's so exciting about it.
it is. It's a really exciting time to be working in this field.
Okay, but with all this talk about AI revolutionizing healthcare,
Hmm.
are there any concerns that we should be thinking about? I mean, it's great that AI can analyze all of this data and make predictions, but should we be worried about becoming too reliant on these systems?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. AI is a tool,
Right.
and like any tool, it can be used for good or for bad.
Yeah.
So I think it's crucial that we approach AI development responsibly
Okay.
with a focus on transparency, accountability, and making sure that these systems are used ethically and equitably.
So it's not just about the technology itself.
Right.
It's also about the...
It's about the values,
Yeah.
the human values
Yeah.
that guide its development and its deployment.
Okay, that's a good point.
Yeah.
So you need to make sure that we're asking the right questions.
Yeah, absolutely. We need to be having these conversations now
Yeah.
to make sure that we're using this technology in a way that benefits everyone.
This has been a really fascinating conversation.
Yeah.
I feel like I've learned a lot about self-supervised learning
Well, I'm glad to hear that.
and its potential impact on healthcare.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating field.
It is, and I think you've done a great job of kind of breaking it down
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
and making it understandable for
Yeah.
people who aren't, AI experts.
Well, that's the goal, right? To make
Mhm.
this accessible to everyone.
Exactly. So before we wrap up, is there anything else that you think our listeners should know about self-supervised learning?
I think one of the most important things to remember is that this is still a very young field.
Right.
We're just scratching the surface of what's possible.
Okay.
And I think the next few years are going to be really, really exciting.
So we should all stay tuned.
Absolutely. There's a lot more to come.
Yeah, like we're kind of entering this new era where AI is not just a tool, but it's almost like a partner
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it.
in this process of discovery.
Mm-hmm.
And, we talked earlier about multimodal learning,
Right.
like AI being able to analyze all these different types of data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, images, text, genomic data, you name it.
Right. So is that where this idea of AI making these connections that humans might have missed comes in?
Exactly. Because it can see the whole picture, right? It can connect those dots between those different data modalities.
Okay, so give me an example. Like, how could that play out in the real world?
Sure. So imagine you have an AI that's looking at both genetic data and brain imaging data, right? Maybe it finds a link between a particular gene variant and a specific pattern of brain activity
Okay.
that's associated with a certain disease.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a human researcher looking at those two data sets separately might not have ever made that connection.
Right, because they're kind of stuck in their own silos.
Exactly. But the AI can see across those silos.
Okay, so it's like having this AI detective that's piecing together all these different clues
Yeah, that's a great analogy.
to solve this medical mystery.
And the more data we give it, the better it gets at solving those mysteries.
Right, so it's almost like we're giving it this giant puzzle and saying, go ahead, figure it out.
Exactly. And it's amazing to watch it work.
It is. It is. But, it also raises some interesting questions about the role of human researchers.
Sure.
I mean, if AI is making all these discoveries on its own, are we going to be out of a job?
Well, I don't think it's about replacement. I think it's about augmentation.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
I mean, AI can handle that heavy lifting, right? Analyzing those massive data sets,
Okay.
but it still needs human guidance and oversight.
Right.
We need to design those experiments. We need to interpret the results and ultimately translate those discoveries into something that can actually help patients.
Okay, so it's more of a collaboration then.
Exactly. It's about AI and humans working together.
To kind of push the boundaries of medical knowledge,
Mm-hmm.
that makes a lot of sense. So, we've talked about all these potential benefits of self-supervised learning.
Yeah.
Are there any risks or challenges that we should be aware of?
Yeah, I think one of the big ones is bias.
Okay.
If the data that we use to train these models is biased, then the models themselves are going to be biased.
All right, so garbage in, garbage out.
Exactly. So we need to be really careful about the data that we use and make sure that it's representative of the population that we're trying to help.
And that's something that we need to be thinking about from the very beginning.
Absolutely. It needs to be baked into the whole process.
Okay, so it's not just about the technology itself. It's about the human values and intentions that guide its development.
Exactly. We need to make sure that we're using this technology for good.
This has been a fascinating deep dive into the world of self-supervised learning. It's clear that this technology has the potential to completely transform healthcare.
It really does.
And I think you've done a great job of explaining it in a way that's both informative and engaging.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
So for our listeners who are just as captivated by this topic as we are, I encourage you to keep exploring, keep asking questions, and stay curious about the ever-evolving world of medical AI.
Absolutely. This is just the beginning.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you later.